I've been up here long enough that you get it. I grew up without a dad, right? Like that. The stories that piece together where you're like, oh yeah, he was raised by a single mom, for sure. For sure. I was hugged and kissed a lot, too. And most little boys were like, no more kisses. And I was like, oh, actually, you missed a cheek. That's who I was. I love the love, man. So I grew up without a dad. My wife grew up with both parents. I don't know if you've heard of that. Every once in a while, two people start a family, and they're just like, let's keep going. What would have happened if we just kept it going, you know? So she's fascinated by the fact that I never met my dad. And she's like, so you never met him? I'm like, no, I never met him. He left when I was a baby. She's like, do you ever think about him? I'm like, no, not really. Never met him, so I don't really think about him. She goes, would you ever want to meet him? And I'm like, good God, no. And she goes, why not? I'm like, because it'd be weird. We don't have anything to talk about. We don't have a relationship to reference, so it would be awkward. And it would be like a first date. And on top of that, he lives in Budapest, Hungary, and only speaks Hungarian. And I only speak English. So if we hung out, it would be like a 90-day fiance date where I'm speaking into my phone like, why'd you leave? I'd rather not do that at an Applebee's, you know? And she's like, I get it now. And I'm like, I figured. So I grew up without a dad, which, if there's anyone in here that grew up without a dad, you might be able to connect to this next chunk. It's just, you naturally find father figures when you grow up. That's just what happens. They just pop up in life. Like, I remember we moved from Hungary, and when we first moved to the United States, my first father figure was on TV. It was Mr. Rogers. Yeah. That guy was great. I love me some Mr. Rogers. He taught me how to speak English because he spoke slowly. He had puppets, kept my attention. He had a stoplight in his living room for some reason. I was like, this guy's pretty rock and roll. I like me some Mr. Rogers. Where do you get a stoplight? Did you steal that from the city? Where does that even come from? And so I loved Mr. Rogers. I remember he had like indoor-outdoor shoes. Remember that? He took off his outdoor shoes, put on his indoor shoes, took off his outdoor cardigan, put on his indoor cardigan. And I grew up kind of poor, so I was like, man, Mr. Rogers is loaded. Like, he's doing all right, you know? I want to be like Mr. Rogers when I grow up. So that was my first father figure, was Mr. Rogers. My second father figure, also on TV a few years later, was a professional wrestler by the name of the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels. Yeah. Cool, a couple people know who he is. Everybody else, I'll explain. Shawn Michaels played like a male stripper type of character. He had like long hair and bushy chest hair, and he sang his own theme song, and the lyrics were, I'm just a sexy boy. And he would sing that over and over again while taking off bedazzled assless chaps. And I was 10 years old, like, hell yeah, dude. This guy rocks. So those were my first two father figures. There's Mr. Rogers and the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels. And sometimes when you're a little boy, you're in situations where you're like, what would a man do in this situation? And I would think of those two, and I just kind of blend them, you know? I was honestly both of those men. Like, I wore cardigans, but I took them off sexy. You know what I mean? Let them slide down the shoulders. My third father figure wasn't a famous person at all. He was just a regular guy. He was my best friend Jason's dad, Daryl Jones. Daryl Jones, yeah, good dude. Daryl Jones ran a mechanic shop in town, and now I worked at this mechanic shop. This was the last real day job I had before I got to do comedy full time, and I didn't work on the cars. I wasn't allowed in there. I worked in the office. I did the computers. I did the bookkeeping. I wrote invoices for customers. Like, he taught me, he's like, hey, if anyone ever pays in cash, you delete that invoice, and we don't tell the government about it. And I'm like, hell yeah, Mr. Jones, you know? That's how I run my business to this day. So I've kept that alive. And Daryl Jones, man, he was a character, dude. I don't know how to describe him. He was a big, heavy-set dude, maybe 300 pounds, big, bushy, white beard. He smoked Marlboro Ultralight 100s. His ass crack hung out when he worked, which isn't that weird. Everyone's ass crack sticks out when you work, right? Like the top quarter, maybe the top third if it's an extra tough day. But his whole ass would hang out. Like he'd be bent over working on a car, and I'd be like, I think I see the back of his knees. I think that's everything you can see, and then some. And he was also kind of oblivious to how much it stuck out, because I remember one time at lunch he told a story. He was like, oh yeah, back in community college I was getting my diesel mechanic license and I was bent over working. He's like, I don't know if you guys noticed, but my ass crack sticks out a little bit when I work. And we were all like, what? Yours? Yeah, a touch, maybe. And he's like, yeah, some joker came by and poured soda pop down my ass crack. And we were like, oh no, what'd you do? He's like, well, I turned around to get him, but he ran off. So I just grabbed a torque wrench and I threw it at him. And I hit him between the shoulder blades, knocked him unconscious. And we were like, oh my God. And he was just over there like, I thought that was the funniest thing that had ever been told. And we were like, is that guy all right? He's like, I don't know. It was like a classic redneck story. You hear something that ends in what sounds like a murder, and then they just trail off at the end. You're like, what happened next? I don't know. I had to get to second period. I was carrying a full schedule. You know? This dude was an interesting character, man. He had all these southern sayings, even though he wasn't from the South. He was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which he claimed was the South. But he was so intimidating, nobody ever corrected him. Like, people would ask him, like, where are you from? He's like, the South. And they're like, where specifically? He's like, Albuquerque. And everyone's like, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, hell yeah. That Mason-Dixon line runs all the way across. Everybody knows that. Straight to Hawaii. Splits the islands. Just intimidating. And he had all these southern sayings that didn't make any sense, but they were terrifying. Like, if we ever had an issue with a customer, he'd be like, get him in the shop. I'll show him how the cow eats the corn. And I was like, what the hell does that mean? How the hell do cows eat corn? And I don't want him to show me, you know? He was a wild dude, man. He's the only guy I've ever met that was banned from Best Buy. He was banned from our neighborhood Best Buy because he choked a kid that worked there. Because he was trying to buy his wife a Christmas gift, and somehow the conversation in the electronics department went sideways. And he said the kid said something rude to him, so he started throttling him, as you do. And while he was choking him, he goes, in a second, I'm gonna turn you loose. What a great thing to say, by the way. If I ever have the opportunity to choke somebody, I'm gonna go, in a second, I'm gonna turn you loose. But he goes, I want that damn memory card on this counter. And he throws him back, and the kid's like, I'm calling security. And he goes, you better call all of them, because I'm fixing to dance. He was like a poet of violence. Like, his words were beautiful, but terrifying. Like, if Charles Bukowski fought in the UFC or something, you're like, what? Mesmerizing. And I know at this point, you're like, this guy was a father figure in your life? He was. Like, listen, he was rough around the edges. A lot of people either loved him or hated him. And the people that hated him were probably assaulted by him. And that's fair. You know, if someone beats you up, you're probably gonna not like that guy. But that's not the relationship I had with him. Like, he treated me like an Honorary Jones. He treated me like a son. He treated me like he's like a dad to me. He never said I love you, just like a real dad. But it was the way he treated me that I could tell how he felt. Like, he knew this was my dream. He knew I wanted to do comedy, and he knew this job was just paying the bills. So he always let me leave to go do my shows, and he's like, your job's here when you come back to it. And I remember one time I had to leave work early to do a show downtown San Diego at the Hard Rock Hotel. It's a private event. I go down there, and I bomb my ass off. Like, I just have the worst set of my entire life. I tried really hard, but it just wasn't in the cards for the Z-Man that night. And maybe because I was calling myself the Z-Man that night. If I'm being honest, it might have rubbed some people the wrong way. But I bombed so bad that at the end of the show, they didn't want to pay me the $400 that they owed me. Yeah, and I remember being demoralized that I bombed so bad, but I still argued for the check. I was like, I think you still have to pay me if I suck. And they begged to differ. So I left without getting paid. And I remember that Monday, I went back to the shop, and I walk in, and Daryl's sitting there smoking his Marlboro Ultralight 100s. He's puffing away, and he's like, how was your little show on Friday? And I'm like, not good. I ate my ass for an hour. And he laughed a little. He's like, that's probably going to happen a few more times, I would assume. And he's like, I'm sure it wasn't as bad as you thought it was. And I'm like, oh no, it's worse than you're thinking. I bombed so bad they didn't pay me the $400 that they owed me. And he's like, really? And I'm like, uh-huh. He's like, they should still pay you if you suck. And I'm like, that's what I said. And I'll never forget this. He took a long puff of his cigarette. He's like, all right, well, give them another call, but if they don't find your check by Friday, maybe you and I close the shop early and we mosey on down to the Hard Rock Hotel and we start tipping things over in the lobby until they find your check. And I could tell by the look in his eyes, he was serious, all right? Not only was he serious, he was kind of excited at the opportunity. He had a twinkle in his eye, like, I would love to vandalize the lobby of a high-end hotel. And I'm on the other side going, oh my God, I hope they find my check. Because I'm gonna be an accomplice. And I was just so blown away, like this man was ready to close his business for an entire day, drive an hour downtown to vandalize the lobby of a high-end hotel so I could get my check. And I was like, this is the love from a dad I've been looking for my entire life. That's what dads are for. That's exactly what dads are for. Dads are there to commit a felony so you can get the check for the dream that you suck at. And I was just blown away, man. I was like, man, so he stuck with me. And Daryl Jones isn't around anymore. He passed away in 2019. He needed a heart transplant, and they wouldn't give him one. And probably for the safety of the community, I often wonder how many ass kickings didn't happen because they didn't give him a new ticker, you know? And but I remember I went to go visit him, and I came on like the worst day. I came on the day that they told him they're not going to give him a new heart. And so I didn't know that showing up. I was like, oh, I'll tell some stories from the road. At the time, I was doing comedy full time. I'm like, he might giggle at this or whatever. And I showed up, and then I found out that they just told him he's not getting a heart. So I'm just sitting in this room with his son and him, and I'd never been with someone that was told they were going to die. So we were just sitting there. It was pretty quiet. And then the priest comes by. I don't know if you know that, but at the hospital, they got a priest that will talk to you if you're about to go. And this priest comes in, and he's like, hey, I know you got some bad news. Do you want me to sit and talk with you a little bit? And Daryl was just himself, even at the end. He's like, hey, listen, man, I don't really believe in any of that stuff. But in case it's true, just put a good word in for me. And I was blown away. I'm like, man, you're going to be yourself even now? That is awesome. And Daryl Jones is in there. That's my third father figure. He doesn't come out much, but he's in there. You know what I mean? Like, he's in there. He was in there. He was in there when I was at the airport and I wanted that bottle of water. He was in there when that lady's like, oh, if you're paying with credit card, you got to go do self-checkout. I can only take cash. Inside, I was like, dude, the cow eats the corn. Like, that's what I felt on the inside. But what came out was Mr. Rogers. What came out was like, well, have a lovely day. And then I stole the water, and as I'm boarding the plane, I'm just dancing like Shawn Michaels all the way down the jetway.